Now it's time to discuss the visitor design pattern. This is the last of the formal Gang of 4 standard design patterns that we're going to take a look at, and we've taken a look at all 23 at this point. This is the 23rd one, the visitor design pattern, and that will be the end of the formal Gang of 4 design patterns. And this one says that if you have a structure, a complex structure such as our corporation structure from before, and you want to define an operation for each of these objects, you don't necessarily have to redefine those objects, redefine the classes. In other words, you don't have to redefine the VP or the division classes in this case. If you just want to define an operation on these objects, the visitor design pattern says that instead you can actually pass a visitor object around the entire structure, and that visitor object will gather the data it needs, and then you can perform the operation on the visitor object, as opposed to having to alter the classes of each of these items, the VP class or the division class. So the visitor design pattern says if you want to add or redefine a operation on objects in a particular object structure, such as the corporation here, you don't have to redefine or alter the classes that exist already. Instead, you can pass a visitor object around. It gathers the data it needs, and you can then operate on the visitor object. Now, the visitor object is called that because it moves from object to object. Visits each of these objects, gathers the data it needs for the operation it wants to perform. And in fact, the visitor object usually is paired with a transversal object that will actually do the moving from object to object, will move up and down the branches and leaves of this tree, for example, of the corporation tree. So you have something like this. You have a transversor, which is responsible for moving from branch to branch and leaf to leaf until the entire tree structure has been transversed, and it interacts with the visitor object. As you see here, the visitor object is the one that stores the data as the two of them transverse the entire structure, the entire object structure. So that's the idea. You have a transversor that goes up and down, transverses the entire tree structure or the entire object structure, and the visitor accompanies that transversor or is connected to that transversor so that you gather all the information you need and stores that information inside the visitor object, and then you can perform your operations on the visitor object, which has stored all the data it needs. The transversor's goal object is to move the visitor around from leaf to leaf, as you see here, moving down one, and that's the idea behind the transversor. The visitor gathers the data it needs, and you can then perform your operation on the visitor object. So if you want to add a new operation or alter an operation that is part of these objects in a object structure or a tree structure, you don't have to actually alter the classes of the objects that are inside this tree structure. That's the whole point of the visitor design pattern. Instead, you can create a visitor that moves throughout the entire structure, gathering the data it needs with the aid of a transversor, which is what actually does the moving from object to object. The visitor gathers the data it needs, then you can perform your operation on the visitor. For example, in the corporation example, you might want to say that determine which of the VPs is ready for retirement. You don't have that built into. Is ready for retirement method is not built into the VP class at all. So instead you might build that into the visitor, and the visitor gathers information, the age of the various VPs, and then when it's done transversing the entire object structure, you can then call your is ready for retirement method on the visitor object. The visitor object will check its internal data, which is presumably the ages of everybody, and determine who's ready for retirement and give you an answer that way. So that's the idea. You don't actually have to change if you're coming up against a question where if you're considering changing the internal structure of the classes in an extended object structure. You don't have to do that with the visitor. The visitor design pattern says instead send the visitor around from object to object, gathering all the information you need, and then perform your operation on the visitor object instead of on the individual VPs and so forth. So that is the visitor design pattern, and that is the last of the formal Gang of 4 design patterns. We've seen all 23 now of their design patterns. We're going to go on now and take a look at some of the other design patterns that are out there.